We will now introduce our next speaker, Gregory.
Okay, so Colonel Gregory, come on up. Colonel Gregory was in the Air Force in the 1950s. He was an RB-57 pilot. He was doing reconnaissance missions around and over the former Soviet Union. He then was recruited by the CIA to fly the U-2s. He was in charge of the CIA U-2 pilots after the May 1st mission. Colonel Gregory lives in Austin, Texas. He drove down yesterday to be at this conference today with me and to share his experiences with you. He will talk about my father, checking him out in a plane to make sure he was still qualified to fly after he returned home. So Colonel Gregory is the first person my father flew with upon his return home. And he can speak to my father's credentials, being a pilot, what he did with the CIA and the U-2 pilots in Edwards Air Force Base back in the mid-60s, and then what he went on to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Colonel Gregory. All right. And his daughter is going to come up and help with the slide presentation. We'll make sure that these things get in, and then we'll turn it over to him.
Is this microphone working?
Oh.
No. Okay. This man is 95 years old. Wow.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to your conference. I thought my daughter was going to give my speech for me. She's a gifted speaker and could do it better than I. But anyhow, I'm pleased to be here. In the spring of 1960, I was squadron commander of the Black Knight RB-57 program at Insular Air Force Base in southern Turkey. It was another high-flying airplane like the U-2, and it was the first plane to fly above 65,000 feet. We were occupying the adjacent hangar to the CIA operation there at Insular in the spring of 1960, and Gary Powers and his team were preparing the last two missions for the two overflights of Russia, one on the 9th of April and one on May the 1st. We were flying along the Soviet border using a highly sophisticated data collection system, and the RB-57D was on its last mission. I'd been in that program for 4 years. So I received orders to return to Washington for an interview with the CIA at that time. And I had the interview with CIA, and I waited the orders that came later. I returned to my base at Del Rio, and I received an appointment to Atsugi Air Force Base in Japan, and I was to be the operations officer. I was a lieutenant colonel at the time, and the commanders were full colonels. So on May the 1st, I'd already sent my whole baggage to Atsugi, and on May the 1st, 1960, I was waiting orders to go to Atsugi. That was the day the U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev didn't say anything for about 3 days. But the CIA was so sure that Gary Powers Sr. had not survived that they told the world a lie, a big story, that the pilot was flying along the Soviet border and due to compass error had inadvertently strayed into Soviet territory. He was 1,300 miles inside the Soviet Union. And the CIA knew about this. They were listening to this thing that was going on at the time. So what they should have done is just simply told the truth. It was a very successful program. The U-2 had completed 24 successful missions, and their government had learned a lot of information that the Soviet threat was not as bad as they had thought it was. And so finally, John McCone wanted Powers, when he came back, to be punished. He ordered a committee to investigate Powers to see if he had violated his contract. The committee met, and they did investigate. They found out he had not violated his contract. Excuse me. So the CIA sent him out then to, I was a commander at that time at Edwards Air Force Base, and they sent him out for me to fly with him twice. I already knew he was a good pilot, but we took those 2 flights. It was the first time he had flown since he had been shot down, and he was really happy to get back in the air again. And so I reported back to them that he was an excellent pilot. So finally, President Eisenhower had said that there would be no more overflights of the U-2. And so my orders to Japan were canceled. And finally, 3 months later, in August of 1960, the decision was made to move the 2 squadrons at Isugi and Insular back to Edwards Air Force Base at the Flight Test Center, but the base was a old World War II base. It had been used very little since, and it was a bad state of disrepair. So I received orders to join this organization at North Base. But all of the former commanders had been released back to the Air Force at that time. And so when I arrived there, I learned that I was the senior officer as a lieutenant colonel. And so remembering the president's statement, I didn't think much was going to happen to this organization because of no more overflights. So the base was really in a mess, and so I decided we'd do a massive cleanup, and then we began flying the airplanes just to keep the organization functioning as a unit. We were continuing these activities in September of 1960 when I received a call from Washington that they asked that we were to run a test exercise, and I was asked to develop a plan where we would deploy for a 3-month period of time to anywhere in the world and use 2 or 3 airplanes. And the headquarters team was going to come out the following week to observe this test. So I called my staff together. We developed a plan where each section would have a period of time to do their part on the airplane 24 hours before takeoff. And it was a good plan. It served us well. This squadron was really one of a kind. I had never been into one like it before or since. But it was a really good squadron. I had a lot more civilians than I did military. But all the civilians, they just worked as hard as everybody else in trying to make sure that we didn't make any mistakes. So we did the exercise, and they wanted 3 missions. We flew the 3 missions, and they all went well. And the team leader said he would report to CIA headquarters that we had passed. And so I was pleased that at least we had passed. But again, I didn't expect to do anything more. But in October, just 5 months after the incident in May, I received a call from Washington that we were to deploy to Del Rio, Texas from Edwards, and that we would begin overflying Cuba in October, November, and mid-December. So we covered the west end of the island to the east end and back again for a almost 3 months period. And at that time, the CIA said they had enough material on hand. And so it was mid-December, and I was happy about that. I thought we were going to be home for Christmas. But a few days later, I got a call from Washington that I was to proceed immediately to Cuba Point Naval Air Station, which is near Subic Bay in the Philippines. And I arrived there just before Christmas, and the fleet was in, and the station commander was going to have a little Christmas Eve party, and I was invited in. And one of the admirals, he just couldn't understand why a commander was sent out there just a day or two before Christmas. But of course, I couldn't tell him that. But just a few days later, in January of 1961, we began overflying Vietnam, which was 4 years before the big buildup in 1965. But after several successful missions over Vietnam in January, February, March, and we finished in mid-April. And so I went back home, and I found my wife Helen and my 2 daughters, Gretchen and Cookie, had left the Christmas tree in place. And so when I walked in, Christmas music was playing in mid-April. A little later, it was a delivery person rang the doorbell, and he saw the Christmas tree and heard the music. He said, "Are y'all a little early or a little late on your celebration?" I told him that we actually celebrated any time we got the chance to, and that was really true in those years. The next mission was over Cuba on the 23rd of May, 1961, and at that same time, Lockheed modified the U-2 for in-flight refueling. And we could fly to the Philippines and to Cuba with the in-flight refueling, and it was a great help. Of course, it kept the pilots in the cockpit a much longer time. But so beginning in January of 1962, Soviet personnel began to arrive in Cuba in large numbers. There were a lot of those, and we made several flights right after that. By March the 21st of that year, 62, we had discovered 35 MiG-17s, 12 MiG-19s, and a lot of Soviet equipment and people. So we flew 3 more flights in June and found a lot more Soviet equipment. But due to bad weather, we were unable to do only 1 flight in July, and then 1 more in August. And on the 29th of August, Bob Erickson, one of my pilots, thoroughly covered the island from one end to the other. It was a 9-hour flight. And my boss called me and asked how I thought it went, and I told him I thought it was okay. The weather was pretty good. And he called back the next day and said it was the most important mission we had ever flown, because we had discovered 8 SA-2 SAM sites, and these are the actual photos of the SAM sites. And you'll notice they're kind of in a circle. The Soviets had always done this in the Soviet Union, which we discovered earlier, and they put the SA-2 SAM sites there, and then they would deploy the ICBM in the center of this area. So we began to find more SAM sites, and we found MiG-21, the very latest of the MiG airplanes. And so by the time the intelligence experts knew exactly where the ICBM would be located, because it would be in the center of the SAM site. And so the next mission was planned to fly directly over this point, and we would be over the island only 10 minutes. And there was a lot of political discussions in Washington as to whether my classified squadron would fly this mission, or if the Air Force unit at Del Rio would take over. So there was President Kennedy finally decided, after long discussions and many heated arguments with the CIA, that the Air Force would fly the first and second mission, and they were going to use our airplanes. The CIA airplanes had the J-75 engine, and it would fly about 4,000 feet higher than the J-57 engine that the Air Force had. Steve Heiser and Rudy Anderson were selected as the first two pilots, and Rudy Anderson was the only casualty of the campaign. He was not killed on the first flight, but about 3 flights later, he was hit by a SAM missile and was the only casualty. They were both excellent pilots, and I knew them well from my time at Del Rio. And the next flight was scheduled on the 14th of October, and there were a number of people from Del Rio that came to the base to be there for the takeoff, and there were 3 generals from SAC headquarters that also came, and the senior general, Compton, he asked that my personnel prepare the airplane. So my camera people prepared the cameras, and the technician did all the things. We did everything that we always did prior to each mission. So Steve Heiser took off on the 14th of May, 14th, yes, and just after midnight from North Base, and so he flew directly to Corpus Christi, and then turned north through this 10-minute route over the island, and so he landed at Orlando, Florida, and when the film was rushed to MPIC headquarters in Washington, and when the film had been developed, as we had expected, the first ICBM was discovered in Cuba. It had a range of 1,100 miles and could reach most U.S. cities. It was an SS-4 model, and the public was totally shocked that there was no knowledge of this, of our 2 years of surveillance, and so they knew nothing about this until the instant it was announced. Few people realized how close we came to go into war at that time, and so the Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marines were the highest state of readiness, and there were several wings of fighter planes that were deployed to South Florida. There were 7 messages exchanged between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and Khrushchev's messages sound very terse and very angry at first that he wasn't going to remove the missiles. But it just so happened that the UN was in session, and it was at a very tense moment that he asked the ambassador from the Soviet Union to admit there were missiles in Cuba. But at that moment, he made the announcement. Adlai Stevenson was our UN ambassador, that there were missiles in Cuba, which showed the world. So on October the 22nd, President Kennedy established a naval blockade of Cuba only 7 days after the public announcement. And there were a lot of Soviet ships bound for Cuba at that time, and so this blockade it went on for 2 more days, and the lead ship finally stopped dead in the water before reaching that point. So Khrushchev finally agreed to remove the missiles and the Soviet airplanes. He felt justified somewhat in deploying these missiles, as we had missiles in Turkey that were aimed at Russia. But he had already planned to remove these missiles, but we hadn't done so. So in just a few short weeks, the Soviets had managed to install 24 of SAM missiles. And by this time, the one missile had increased to 4. They had increased 3 more missiles during that 1 week. They had 4 launches at each site, 39 of the latest MiG fighters. They had over 100 of the new fighter planes, and there was a 1,200-man battle group equipped with tanks and battlefield missions, and given more time, they would have assembled an even more formidable force. Several years later, an expert was asked the value of this little piece of film that Alice Stevenson showed the world, that there were missiles in Cuba, and he said, well, of course it was invaluable, probably worth more than the CIA had ever spent in all their time. So the next thing, in the summer of 1964, my boss, John Jack Ledford, came for a visit at Edwards, and he wanted me to go with him to Area 51. This has been a highly speculated place in the world, Area 51, and the press wondered what goes on there. And so at this time, the SR-71, the Mach 3 airplane, was just beginning the test there at that base. He wanted me to see the base, and he offered me the job on the spot of being the SR-71 operations officer, and it was a job of a lifetime. But 10 days earlier, I had just returned from another long temporary duty, and my wife this time, she was always so supportive, and said, I just don't know how much longer I can tolerate all these separations. I had been gone more than half the time for the past 8.5 years or 9 years, and she just felt like the life was passing her by, and so I had to think about this, and so I thanked General Ledford very much, but I eventually turned it down to be with my family. I probably would have gotten another promotion, but it was worth it, and I don't regret my decision. The role of my covert squadron in the Cuban Missile Crisis was never made public. However, actually the CIA deserves credit for their role. You know, they made so many blunders over the years, but this is one thing that was helpful, that they did good. And my wife was invited to a special permission to attend a ceremony at North Base, where I received another Legion of Merit, making my 4th. And I was also promoted finally to colonel 3 years ahead of when I should have been. And General Marshall Carter also presented me with the CIA Medal of Merit, and my pilots all received the CIA Star Medal. And General President Kennedy also sent a letter praising the squadron for the work that we had done. And so I was permitted to share the contents of the letter, and my people were really happy that they had made this contribution. So my squadron's role in the Cuban Missile Crisis was never made public, and the CIA medal and letter, they were taken back to Langley, but on October the 17th, in 1975, the mission was finally declassified, and I could at least talk about it then. And so, finally in closing, on October the 17th of 1962, the whole country was just shocked that we had missiles in Cuba. And my family knew about this, and my mother and father knew about this, but they never knew in their lifetime that I had a small role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you very much.
Greg Gregory.